Good afternoon. Um, Hopefully everything's working out with the mic. I think I might switch mics, um, but it looks okay. So we're getting started here with Hillside, and we're all good to go. You're going to see some changes in the office. We're doing some rearranging. I'm trusting that people will just kind of come on as they come on. But I'm hoping that some folks decide to join us. I'm expecting at least one or two people to actually go on live. Now, these can't be set up as events in the same way that I can with StreamYard or Restream. So I didn't even try it because I really didn't want any trouble with the platform. But some things I can do, and I just got to do different types of meetings for different things. So this is our Sunday school. Let me get the PowerPoint up and start to do a screen share. And that'll actually end up working pretty good. This is screen 2, so you should be able to see screen 2 now. And that's actually up and running. I am going ahead and just taking a look here at what's going on. You should be able to see me in the corner. And we're going to get started with our PowerPoint. I'm just going to pretty much teach through this. I hope that this is the end of Leviticus. Now, plans are in work for me to start an outreach Zoom Bible study, and I would appreciate prayer for that as I prepare to go ahead and do that and pick up other things. This is a new venture, but not for all CPM missionaries. I've been exclusively live streaming programs, but not doing open Bible studies via Zoom. And so I'm really hoping this will be a new avenue of ministry, and I'll be able to build some upon this, but I'm not ultimately sure. And so that's where I'm kind of excited about the possibilities. We've got the PowerPoint there up, so let's get started with that PowerPoint. We are at the end of the Book of Leviticus. Now, this will be kind of a fast movement through Leviticus. So there's more exegesis that could be done here. When I say exegesis, I mean Bible interpretation. That's what good Bible interpretation really is. I am doing a flyover. Some of these directions have been repeated in other places in Scripture. So I do not want to belabor them. When we start talking about the year of Jubilee, I could then go all the way back through the year of Jubilee, and exegesis-wise, I could review that. But there's enough material here. And that's one of the problems with the old Jewish Parsha system, is that there was so much material that the details kind of got lost. So I tried to pick the middle ground between the details and the whole thing. And so this is where we are going. How does Leviticus end? Adventures in Leviticus. So we're going to look at the end of this. Now, remember, I always do last week's take-home truth. And so, as usual, I have done that again. I have done last week's take-home truth. It follows, if one follows a covenant-keeping God, it is important that one keeps his own covenants. And that was the take-home from last week. And so I don't want to share that per se unless any comments come up. But at least I know it's there. And I can go ahead and do that. In fact, I can also move it out of the way and just do this. And that'll actually be better for us. There we go. So that's the new slide. There we go. There we go. That's much better. And now I am not looking at the scriptures. I am looking at where you guys are. So I'm going to keep remembering that the thing is on one side and you're on the other now. We start with animals. Remember, we talked about the valuation of people. Now we're talking about the valuation of animals. We have to deal with buildings. And under that heading, there are houses and fields. We're going to go over that. And now we're dealing with with animals. Now, remember, this is all about people making a vow to God. And then in making a vow to God, the danger was that they would make exorbitant vows to God, moved by piety, but not necessarily thinking about what they were doing. And so something was put in place by which one could redeem that which they vowed. And so this whole section we've talked about in terms of that, but we only dealt with people. And you're going to see that the law often has sections based to particular situations. So we talked about this being causuary law as opposed to the other type of law, epidictic. And I hopefully that came across through the mic okay. Those permanent commands like thou shalt not kill are not case law, they're epidictic law. And so we have case law or causuary law when we have an if-then sort of statement. And so this is all if-then. Now, different sections have to deal with the same law being applied to different situations. And that's what you're going to find with if-then law. Ravi Zacharias once said if we followed the 10 commandments, which would be epidictic law, we wouldn't need all these other laws, which are causuary. And so let's see what God actually says. We're going to be looking at verses 13 through 17. You can open your Bibles there, and it should appear on the screen. And what I like about having two monitors is you guys can actually see the scriptures. So if you don't want to open your Bible, or you're reading on a smaller cell phone or something, you can look up and see this. If there is an animal that man may bring as an offering to the Lord, all that anyone brings to the Lord shall be holy, and he shall not substitute it or exchange it, good for bad or bad for good. And if he at all exchanges animal for animal, then both it and the one exchanged shall be considered holy. If it is an unclean animal, which they do not offer as a sacrifice, then he shall present the animal before the priest, and the priest shall set a value on it, whether it is good or bad, as you, the priest, value it, so shall it be. And if he wants at all to redeem it, he must add a fifth to the valuation. So these are the commands that are being given in relationship to the valuation of animals. And we're going to talk about these laws, and we're going to get some application. Now, it's tricky because we don't have a sacrificial system, but there are principles that carry over. And that's the way, and my dissertation profs liked it, the way I think you should look at the law is to see what the law is pointing us to as a principle, and then from the principle to the character of God, because we're supposed to be image bearers. And so let's start taking a look at this. Now, there is a little delay, even on Zoom. So when you get there, you should be able to see the slide change. And if it doesn't change, well, then I'll be sharing a different screen now, won't I? There we go. The basic principle one are two Hebrew words. Now, that first Hebrew word, and you see a dash between them, is the negative particle. And what I'm focusing on as the first principle is you shall not exchange it. So you give something to God, you have to redeem it. You can't just play swap out any old way you want to. All right. And so that's what you're dealing there with. And you have an imperfect and you have a negative particle here. So this is, even though it's case law, it's kind of enshrined. If the animal were vowed of cattle, it would be offered for sacrifice, everything that was given to. And I want a little pardon here. This is Kyle and Delich, and they're doing the Jehovah thing. If you're talking to your Jehovah's Witness friend, Jehovah was actually a way of not saying God's name. It's an Anglicization of the Hebrew in which takes the consonants of the sacred name and then the vowels from the word Adonai. And so Jews will say Adonai. And so the exact pronunciation of that particular four consonant sacred name is not known. And so if your Jehovah's Witness says that you need to use the word Jehovah, you can point out to him that that's the name that was used because people didn't want to say the actual name. And so that's an apologetics tip for you. For a funny presentation of this same material, you can go to Lutheran Satire on YouTube. There's some funny yet poignant videos there that have some great material. I can't show them to you because I don't know. That just seems like, I don't want to steal other people's material. But I would say to you, if you want some really poignant doctrinal points and apologetic points, and you want some humor with two Irish peasants from like the 1100s or something, you can go there. It's very well done. And so I really kind of appreciate the work that was done on that. It can't be exchanged. Good for bad or bad for good, a good one for a bad one or a bad one for a good one is simply the idea it can't be exchanged. You're dealing with kind of a Hebrewism, okay? And it's pointing out that you can't go both ways. If such an exchange should be made, the animal first dedicated and the one substituted are both holy, which produces a bit of a problem. Okay. In fact, Kyle and Delich point out the expression, it shall be holy, unquestionably implies that the animal of this kind cannot be redeemed. And so they're kind of pointing this whole thing out. And so that's the Kyle and Delich commentary on that Hebrew phrase, which appears. And I'm going to make sure that this exchanges. There we go. So I'm making sure that everything works okay. And everything's coming through. Since there are no people telling me the sound isn't working, then I will assume that the sound is working. And I'll assume that I'm kind of in a position of not having a large crowd today. And so let's keep moving on. You should see the screen change again. At least I'm hoping it does. And you should get the other screen. If not, then I will do the old switcheroo. And I will put up the other screen in order to have this screen actually show. There we go. It doesn't seem to be changing at all, which I'm not quite sure what is happening with that. So I'm going to temporarily stop the screen share. I'm going to try to stop the screen share. Daniel, we started a little bit, but you're not too late.
Hi there. Sorry I'm late.
That's okay. I'm working with the Zoom here in order to get that up. The screen isn't changing quite the way I want, but everything else has been working really well. So I might need to stop the share for just a second. Go ahead and acknowledge you and then go back into the screen share.
You're good. I'm in the middle of something else too, so sorry.
That's okay. I'm using a second screen, which I really like because the Bible is so much larger with a second screen than it is with just one screen. And so I think that gives people an advantage. And I told them that if their cell phone was small or something, they could just read the text right from there. And so I'm not quite sure. I might have to bring this to a screen one position and do it that way because it doesn't seem to want to share the screen the way I want it to. I could try this and see if that does it. All right, well, There you go. I'm not quite sure. I thought things were going a little too well. So there's our challenge for the morning. Just out of curiosity, Daniel, what do you see on your screen?
I see. What's the point?
Excellent. Well, then you're seeing correctly.
Good, good.
And everyone else is just going to have to go ahead and wait. Or the joint is I'll have an editing computer soon, so maybe I can make that work a little bit better. But we have the what's the point there. It would just be nice to see the what's the point the way you're seeing the what's the point. So I may shift this over just to be able to see it, and then do this. Zoom. There we go. Oh, your screen sharing is paused. Okay. And that's because I went ahead and switched screens. So.
Well, I could still see it.
Can you?
Now I just see you.
Okay. Well, that's an interesting thing. I'll just share that and it should work. And I just went ahead and just changed the screen I'm sharing. And that allows me to see it and allows you to see it too.
Yep, I see it.
I don't know what YouTube will do with that, but that is what it is. And that's what our friend is asking Matthew here. And so he wants to get the point. Once the animal was donated to the Lord, it was considered holy. So anything you give to the Lord is considered holy. And that would be true anywhere in life at all. If you give it to God, it's considered holy. And holy is set aside for God's purposes. And so we need to understand what holy really means. Kadosh has the idea of something being set aside for God's purposes. By the way, the Greek hagios has the same idea. And so now, once that's dedicated to the Lord, it's his. You can't Indian give with God. Sorry, bad cultural reference. You can't just take back what you've given from God. No offense to my Native Americans, brothers and sisters, because I have a dear friend named Phil Fox. But if you feel any better, the term Jew somebody down, unfortunately, is still used in the South. So let's just say you can't just exchange, you can't just take it back. Okay. So the unclean animal. Now, what's important to understand here is I don't think the idea is you offer pigs to God. Okay. An unclean animal might be an animal that is defective in some way. So you had to give your best to God. If the animal was blemished, it couldn't be presented to the Lord. Now, if it was a kosher animal and it was blemished, it still was unacceptable to God. Because what had to be offered to God was without defect. That's why the New Testament makes reference to Jesus being blameless and without fault. Because the sacrificial system had an animal that had to be presented that was perfect. So in the same way, Peter makes point to a lamb without blemish. And those sorts of expressions are to point out that just as the sacrificial animal had to be without blemish, so too Jesus was without moral blemish. And so what the priest had to do if an animal was not up to snuff was to still put a value on the animal, because the animal may be a perfectly good milking goat, but it may have a defect or blemish in some way that would prevent it from being sacrificial material, but would not prevent it from still having value. Do you see what I'm saying? a cow with a slightly bad leg or something wouldn't necessarily be able to be sacrificed, but it would still have value. And so there was a procedure there. And the second principle is that an unclean animal can't be offered. In other words, you cannot offer to the God something that is imperfect. And I wish we'd get this through as we're sharing the gospel with people. What most unsaved people think is that we're saying they're not nice. And I've had this sort of discussion with my dad. We are not claiming that people are not nice. We are claiming that they are flawed. And that God is a God who is perfect. And so the things which reflect him must also be perfect too, or they would misrepresent him. And we want to be careful of churchese. Churchese makes sense to church people, but it makes sense to nobody else. Because there's a whole context to Scripture. And once you get saved, you begin learning the terminology and the context. And if you don't have that context, you might very well feel insulted. And remember, too, that the unbeliever does not understand the idea of a sin nature. I certainly didn't. And so when you told me I was a sinner from birth, that made no sense to me. But we can say things like what I said to my dad. Okay, I acknowledge that our founding fathers were not perfect. And here were some of their flaws. And what I'm saying is none of us are morally unflawed or undamaged. We're morally damaged and morally flawed. And so the animals, in order to teach the children of Israel that holiness involved perfection, not niceness. Because the imperfect animal could be a very nice sheep. It could be an absolutely pleasant sheep. It may be a goat that gives great milk. That's not the point. In some way, that animal is flawed. And the idea is just as God does not accept flawed things. This is where I'll tell people God doesn't grade on a curve. Okay? It's either 100%, it's pass fail. It's 100% or not 100%. And people say, why? Because God is 100%. And if he accepts less than 100%, he ceases to be 100%. So I know Pastor Brian says, share with people, God is holy, you are not. Jesus is the answer. Get saved. The problem is that when you use a word like holiness, you've already left a good part of the American audience behind. And even the religious Jew may not understand that term quite the way a seasoned follower of Messiah may understand that term.
But with a religious Jew, you could come back to the principle of the unblemished animal and the temple sacrifice, right?
Well, and
you don't have the same with Christians, or with non-Christians, or rather secular people.
The advantage of with the Jewish person is you can say, this is what your book says. You should understand this.
Yeah.
This is what's available to your people. You mean you haven't understood this? What did Jesus say to Nicodemus? You are a teacher of Israel and you do not understand these things? You can say to the Jewish person, this is your book. This is your background. You didn't understand this? Let me explain this to you. And by the way, why is it that I have a greater passion to understand your book than you do? You ought to be the first person in the world to try and be digging into this stuff. Now,
Yeah,
I'm not insulting you, but
yeah,
I'm curious about your lack of curiosity. Go ahead.
Yeah, you inadvertently raised another point. You want to be very careful not to be insulting or to try to shame them into something.
Yeah. But you can say, isn't it curious that I am so interested in these things?
Yeah, that is.
Why would that be? That I would be so interested in what was your law?
Yeah.
So I'm just making sure that I can change the PowerPoint. There we go. Okay, and so we got another what's the point? And one of the reasons I'm doing this is the day may come when I record some things. And I do really bad without an audience. I'm a teacher, so teachers need an audience, right? And so I have my audience. I have my virtual friends there. And so Miguel comes in and helps me by asking important questions. And he may be asking the question that no one thought of, or maybe that someone should think of. And that's a great way to teach, is to just pose the question and then answer it. Because hopefully you're getting people thinking about the questions as well as the answer. Now, one of the points of this, of course, is that you didn't just get to pay for the animal's cost, right? Let's go back to Logos Bible software, if I dare. Bring that up and then change screen shares so that you can see the Logos Bible software. And maybe that will appear a little better on Facebook, but there's Logos. And I can do a screen 2 there and switch my screen. Okay, and what that should do is change this to the screen here.
Yeah, I see your parallel text.
Yep. And so what you're looking at is, if you look down through there, and I'll look at it together with you. I mean, I know that you're not totally kosher here, but if I'm going to talk about the Word of God, I better be sure here. Okay. But you'll see in verse 13 that 1/5 value needs to be added to it. And I have my cursor there. So if that shows it all on YouTube, there's that 1/5. And I'm kind of highlighting it. So the price for redeeming the animal was more than just the animal's price. It was actually plus the 1/5. So changing your mind carried with it something. You might want to think about it from the standpoint of, hey, this is going to cost me something, if that makes any sense at all.
Well, that's the whole point of a sacrifice, right?
Well, that's the point of a sacrifice, but changing your mind also costed you.
Yeah.
And that's what I kind of want to bring across, is that, willy-nilly, just going ahead and changing your mind left and right probably wasn't a good economic thing to do. Okay. Yeah. Oh, they actually have a new share up there. Why didn't I think of that? Well,
maybe that was put in there not for the person who has to choose between an unblemished and a less perfect animal, but maybe someone who didn't have an unblemished animal.
Yeah, but they'd still have the additional surcharge. By the way, sure. What fraction is 1/5?
What do you mean? What fraction is 1/5? It's 20%.
That's right. That's what I was getting at. So there's a 20% surcharge.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm just giving people an idea of, take a regular amount of money here, not to get into accounting, but, that's 20 cents on the dollar. So, you could start doing the math, and you're talking about $5. You could do the math and figure out. But when you start talking about animals, the price of a cow, which now, I'm out of touch with Vermont farmers, but cows used to go for, I think, ranges anywhere from like 500 to 1,000. You take 20% of that, and you're into some real money.
Yeah. Depends on whether it's a cow or a bull or a calf or a milker or whatever.
Yeah. And again, when I was in Vermont, I was constantly around farmers, usually dairy farmers. So the value of the cow was either in the stud fees or in the milk that the cow would generally produce. Some cows produce more milk than others. And my wife grew up spending summers on a dairy farm her grandfather had. And so this could get into some real money here or there. And so you could see that, you didn't want to be making vows that you had no intention of keeping, because that would actually could get pretty costly. It also made the seriousness of a vow kind of come home to you, if you think about it. Because, this is the thing I've thought about a little with COVID. If it doesn't hurt, we don't pay attention sometimes. I mean, that sounds horrible, doesn't it? But sometimes a little bit of ouch makes us think about doing it again. With C.S. Lewis, one of his quotes that isn't fun to contemplate, but is a good quote, is that God whispers to us through our pleasures, speaks to us in our consciences, and shouts in our pains. And so sometimes having a little bit of a consequence makes us a little circumspect before we do something. Now, I'm not saying our Heavenly Father delights in making our lives as miserable as possible, but I'm saying he makes use of the bitter and the sweet, and sometimes the bitter leaves a little more of a lasting impression. It could be the other way around. There are positive things, like were shared in the testimony this morning, that were positive things that made an impression. So God doesn't always have to beat us with a stick to get our attention. But yet, even in those things, some of those events were not pleasant in themselves. And so there's a surcharge there. What's important to understand is not fulfilling one's vow and just skipping it was unacceptable. And so you need to take this seriously.
Yeah.
And that's the bottom line here, is that God did not want this to be treated as an unserious sort of thing. He wanted it dealt with very seriously. And so that money helps. Now, houses also could be dedicated. And I've heard of people dedicating their house to the Lord. The principle is really, really sweet. Just realize that in the Old Testament, that meant the priest owned the house and you didn't. And sometimes believers will take Old Testament things and they won't put them in the context in which they were originally given. So the idea of dedicating one house is okay, but you're not dedicating it in the same way that the Old Testament believer did, because you still get to retain the use of the house. See, an Old Testament believer lost the use of anything he dedicated to God. So when you're dedicating the house to the Lord today, you're not dedicating it in the same sense that the Old Testament believer was. You still have the use of that house. I like the idea of invoking or inviting the Lord a little better, because that doesn't imply the lack of the use of the thing you've received, but it equally implies that it belongs to God. So you could go with the word dedicate. You just got to be attention to the fact that it works slightly differently now. Or you can go with the word of I don't know, maybe dedicate isn't such a bad word. Just keeping in mind you retain use.
I think it works. It's just in your witnessing to non-Christians, you might have to explain it.
Yeah. We have chose to acknowledge that the ultimate owner of this house is God. Now the same principle exists here. You can't just swap out. And by the way, swapping good for bad comes up in Malachi, where they start giving damaged animals to God. And I thought about going to Malachi and talking about Malachi's complaint. And I may be able to do that real quick by opening another tab. Now, this is an interesting prospect, but I can actually have more than one tab in Logos Bible software. I do want you to notice what happens when I open a tab here. I have a polyglot going. That's what I call it. And it's probably a little taxing on the computer. So, and I always do this. I love doing this. This is a Septuagint. This is the Hebrew text, and this is the English. And for anyone who has this software, I could tell you how to set this up, because what it allows you to do, especially with the languages, as you can see, is that if I go here and I screen share, you can see that you have access to the entire languages. And so that's what's really kind of neat. And I'm going to go
see what about a house?
Yep, because I'm changing it over. There you go. Screen 2. And that should go ahead, and I can do new share. I like that new share feature. Okay. But what you should see, did it change? The green is not
It did
changing.
not.
Ooh. Okay. Let me go there. It's supposed to be able to new share. And I'm getting new share. There we go. Now it's green.
No,
So
I see it again.
Yeah. Now that's what the green does. But what you want to see is that I have the access to do this. Not only do I have a knowledge of the Greek and Hebrew, but I can move between the languages to see what the equivalents are. So that even if you didn't have a seminary knowledge of Greek and Hebrew, I still have the power to go ahead and do a word study on this if I should so choose. And there's the word exchange. So I can look at this and then say, well, you know, what Greek word was used when God decided to translate this over? Okay. And then at the bottom, to interchange or exchange. And there's your Greek word. And then I can say, okay, where else does this Greek word appear? Because this has the Old Testament concept of exchanging translated into Greek. So where does this concept of exchange appear? And that's the fun stuff you can do with exegesis, interpretation. And that's what, you know, your pastor who uses Logos is going to spend time doing that sort of thing. And he's going to look at the equivalents and he's going to pull them up, you know. And then you might say, wow, you know, if I was really doing this as a deep word by word study, I'd say, okay, so now I'm going to do a study following that word exchange all the way through the New Testament from the Old. And say, what do we learn about this concept of exchange? Is it related to redemption and Jesus's death? Or are other words used for Jesus's death, and why? And so that's just a little bit of fun that we can have. Let me get back to the message at hand here. Okay. And I'm going to go ahead and new share back here. And see if I go green. There we go. And green is good for go. And so that brings us back to this. Now, again, you have the 1/5, which you see up on the slide. Now, if it's a field, it's a little different. We're going to talk about fields because houses were different than fields. A house was the actual building, like the house I live in, which I could not go ahead and give to the Lord because I don't have possession of it. I'm a renter. But the house was the actual building. If I say my house, especially out here in Vermont, the house included the land. But in Phoenix, I got like a postage stamp backyard. So we won't even discuss growing barley there. And we're going to see that fields had to be evaluated differently than houses. Okay. The other thing that comes into play here is the year of Jubilee. Now, see, that didn't happen with animals because they were sacrificed oftentimes. If it was a clean, good animal, it was killed and sacrificed. So you can't get it back in the year of Jubilee. It's dead. It's gone. It's eaten. It's used. It's burned up. It's not there. Okay. But the year of Jubilee fits into this, especially as we enter fields. And so we go from houses to fields. Now, understand, those were the land options. If we're playing Monopoly here, you've got the field and you've got the house. Okay. The money has to take into account the year of Jubilee. And so the year of Jubilee is going to get mentioned with a field. In either case, in the case of a house or an animal, okay, and we're going to get to the firstborn, and I really want to get to the firstborn today. So I'm going to start moving along because the law of the firstborn is still practiced among Jewish people. So this gets very interesting. It's still going to cost. Now, once that person has redeemed it, it's theirs again. But it's still expensive. Now, with a field, owning dirt doesn't mean anything. Someone once said to me, you know, have you ever thinking about leaving the Phoenix field as far as CPM? And dirt is dirt. It's what the dirt represents. Okay. My friends who went to Papua New Guinea, they weren't interested in witnessing to the banana trees. Okay. What's important about land is what you can grow on it. That's why it's a usable resource, because you can sow seed and the land will grow and return a crop. And if it's good land, it'll return a good crop. All right. If a man dedicates to the Lord part of a field of his possession, then the valuation shall be according to the seed for it. A homer of barley seed shall be valued at 50 shekels of silver. So it's what you could grow on the land. So unlike the house and unlike the animal, okay, and unlike a person giving themselves, like Samuel, who's dedicated to the Lord, the value is in the crop that could be grown on it. So the seed you sowed on that land is where the value was. Now, barley is an early crop in Israel. And so your barley harvest occurs around the time of Ruth and is what is associated with Pentecost. But there was an early harvest and a latter harvest. And so the crop value is what determines everything. And that's verse 16 of Leviticus. But with land, it reverts back to the original owner during the year of Jubilee. See where that affects things? I'm trusting that's a yes, Daniel. By the way, you have emoticons.
That was going to be one of my questions, but you just answered it.
Okay. That's okay. And by the way, if you have a question, there are these little emoticon-y things, you know, the thumbs up and stuff. Have you ever used them on Zoom?
I have, but I have to do Zoom on my phone because my computer won't allow me to use Zoom. Yeah.
Is it a Mac?
No, it's not a Mac. It's my work laptop, but where I work, they prohibited the use of Zoom because of security risks.
Okay. See what
Zoom,
they did at
Zoom enables bad actors to extract data from host computers.
Okay. I know they're working on that. What we had to do was put a passcode in place and
they're not working on it.
That's
not a bug. That's a feature.
Well, I know, but
yeah. Our company's had data stolen through Zoom, so it is now outlawed on our system.
Oh, okay. Because I didn't know if Zoom worked. I've got my laptop, but my son wants me to have a production Mac.
Yeah.
So actually, you could advise me about Parallels if you know anything about it later. But Parallels is a program that lets you move between the Windows operating system and a Mac operating system.
Yeah. I don't use it. I know what you're talking about, though.
Yeah. Okay. Let's get back to where we were. The year of Jubilee changes everything because the land reverts back to the person in the year of Jubilee. All debts and vows kind of reverse, and we'll talk about why this is. But he who dedicates a field and wishes to redeem it has to add the 1/5. If he does not want to redeem it, the field, he sold the field to another man, it shall not be redeemed. So you can't go ahead and play this game where I buy this house where I'm living, even though it's not a field, and just decide that I want to buy it back for the same sort of price. If it's not mine, I can't give it. So it shan't be redeemed anymore. So there are games you couldn't play. But the field, when it is released in Jubilee, shall be holy to the Lord as a dedicated field. It shall be a possession of the priest. Okay, so now if you have a field you sold to someone else, it's released in Jubilee. But now there's a problem here, with it being dedicated. And you've got this sort of situation going on here. And I had to think through following some of these situations because they get complicated. When it's released in Jubilee, in this case, it still remains the priest. If a man's dedicated to the Lord a field which he has bought, which is not the field of his possession, the priest shall reckon the worth of its valuation up to the year of Jubilee. So what we're getting here with Jubilee, okay, is that if he wants to go ahead and redeem it, the priest reckons the value up to the year of Jubilee. So if this has occurred so many years in, the value is based on when and then the year of Jubilee. Okay. And he shall give the valuation on that day as a holy offering to the Lord. In the year of Jubilee, the field shall return to him who bought it, and the one who owned the land as a possession. And all your valuation shall be according to the shekel of the sanctuary. I know that's complicated. No price rigging here, where you decide to use less than a currency of equal value. And so the currency is set. The value of the currency is sent to the temple or sanctuary shekel. This becomes important because remember the money changers? They were doing exchange between Roman money and the shekel, the sanctuary shekel. And so that kind of helps you, because a picture of Caesar was not welcome in the temple area. And so Miguel is like, wow, this is really complicated stuff that we don't have to deal with anymore. So who really cares? Equity is in view here. The principle of the year of Jubilee is a thing that is an illustration of God's redemption and grace. Don't miss that. The year of Jubilee, and I can't play the Michael Card song because it's copyrighted. I wish I could. Michael Card has a whole song about the year of Jubilee and how Jesus is the embodiment of God's year of Jubilee, which was a living illustration of redemption and grace. Because if you got yourself in debt, the debt was forgiven. And always remember this in your Bible. Moral debt, financial debt is an illustration of moral debt because of the connection. It wasn't like people compartmentalized like we do in the West. Well, these are my finances, and this is my personal life, and this is my religious life. It didn't work like that back then. What you did in your financial life was a direct reflection of your faith. So if you were in debt financially, that was a picture of moral debt. And if you were in debt financially, you had moral obligation. We have all sorts of ways around moral obligation. And so this release of Jubilee meant that everyone's debts were forgiven, and it was a giant picture of forgiveness. So God doesn't compromise the year of Jubilee, but yet he doesn't compromise the idea that equity or justice, if you vowed something, has to be preserved. You have to make good on what you promise. We are so far removed from some of these basic moral principles. Okay, I mean, I know of situations through my family where somebody just doesn't show up for work and one of them has to go in without even calling in. This idea of moral obligation and proper shame. I don't mean like destructive shame, because there is such a thing. But there's proper shame at defaulting or failure to meet an obligation and the desire to make it right. And we need that back in our society. And we're missing it. And so to preserve both the illustration of grace and redemption in the year of Jubilee, and to maintain the principle of equity and the holiness of God, there's this whole system set up. Let's keep moving because we're getting to some juicy stuff here. The firstborn of the animals shall be the Lord's firstborn. No man shall dedicate it, whether ox or sheep, for it is the Lord's. In other words, automatically, the firstborn belong to the Lord. If it is an unclean animal, then it cannot be sacrificed. So it shall be redeemed according to its valuation plus 1/5. Or if it is not redeemed, it shall be sold. Why? Because an imperfect animal can't be offered according to its valuation. Nevertheless, no devoted offering that a man may devote to the Lord of all that he does, man and beast, or field of possession shall be sold or redeemed. The devoted thing is most holy to the Lord. God gets the firstborn. God gets the first of everything because the first represents the whole. So God always gets the first. He gets the best. He gets the top. But there's more to it than that. Jews still observe a Jewish custom with a firstborn son or daughter known as Bidyan ha-ben. And this is still observed. And I, as a child, went through this ceremony. So I went to a Jewish website called ash.com. It's pretty good. Covers areas of Jewish law and practice and custom. And it talks about this ceremony called Bidyan ha-ben, which was done with me. Okay. It takes place when the baby is 31 days old and involves the buying him back from a priest. Now, that's someone in the family who claims a priestly lineage. And so we had an uncle that claimed to be or believed he was from, for reasons. Jews have tried to preserve the priestly lines, not all the 12 tribes, but had a last name that indicated he was of priestly descent. And so this process was done with me. It's still an active process. Okay. There are exemptions. That's because the rabbis have a loophole for every rule they make.
Are you saying you're a Levite?
No, I'm saying I'm a firstborn, and my uncle was a Levite, and so this was done with my parents having to redeem me from my uncle for a price.
I see.
No, I'm just an Israelite. So I would be from one of the other 10 tribes. Okay. The background's complex, all right? But I want you to understand something. The original intent of God was that the firstborn would be the priests. Okay. Then later on, God says that the Levites will replace the firstborn. And so God will give the Levites, the sons of Levi and the sons of Aaron, instead of or as a replacement for the firstborn that were rightly his and should have had that function. Now, why did God do this? Because of the golden calf. Remember the golden calf incident in Exodus 32?
Yes.
Well, Moses comes down off the mountain. He finds out they've been already going astray. He's been gone for a little while.
Right.
And so he says, whoever's on the Lord's side, come over here. And the Levites are the one tribe that intact come as a full, pretty much, majorly come as a group. And so God says, okay, here are all the firstborn of all the other tribes. They didn't do real good while you were gone. And so now I will give the Levites and the sons of Aaron as a replacement for the firstborn. So now the firstborn of the families have forfeited their Kohen or priestly status. And now all priests come from the tribe of Levi. That's Numbers 3, 11, and 12. But still the firstborn belong to the Lord. And so there's this ceremony. And the connection to the ceremony is Exodus 13, 1 and 2. And the Lord spoke to Moses saying, consecrate to me all the firstborn who opened the womb among the children of Israel, both man and beast is mine. Now, let me ask a question here that Miguel didn't think to ask. Why the firstborn in conjunction with the Exodus? Think back to the Exodus, that's chapter 12, and the last plague, and then think one chapter over. What was the last plague and how did it impact the firstborn of Egypt?
The death of the firstborn.
Exactly. So God spares the firstborn through the applying of the blood on the doorposts. Okay. And then says, being that I spared the firstborn among you, the firstborn belonged to me. I have redeemed them. They're mine. I bought them back. They belong to me. My dad made a mistake once of saying that Passover is about freedom. Passover is not about freedom. And some Reformed Jews and non-observant Jews have gotten the idea that Passover is about freedom. It's not about freedom. It's about redemption. The Israelites being attached to Egypt when he judged their false gods were in danger of being judged right along, and God buys them back from slavery and from judgment.
That's an important distinction.
It is a real important distinction. God didn't give them freedom. He gave them redemption. And we need to get the difference and understand something here. When they were under Egypt, even though they were gods and they could continue personally to try to be faithful, I'm not saying no one was faithful. You have to understand that they rightly came under the jurisdiction of those false gods, which were indeed satanic. And so let me draw an analogy for you, which I hadn't even intended in the PowerPoint. That's why I have a problem taping this, because I probably would have went down this road. But I want you to see the thing here. Okay? They were under the jurisdiction of the evil one, and God bought them back from the sphere of the Egyptian false gods that were connected to Satan. And then God says, since I bought them back, they're mine. Do you see the cool analogy here?
Yep.
And so understand that firstborn terminology. Okay, because this whole concept of the firstborn moves right into the New Testament. All right. And so originally, God ended up doing this. The reason for firstborn males is that the male was the priest head of the family who offered offerings for his family. Well, Abraham did. Who offered offerings for his kids? Job did. Who offered offerings for his family when they got out of the ark? Noah did. The father was the priest head of his household. And so each firstborn would represent each family. And the man was the priest head representative before God for his household. Oh, goody. Rachel's joined us, and she says, why is this important? Let me tell you a funny story here. When I was born, we had to go through this ceremony at 30 days. And so I was redeemed back, rightly belonging to God as a firstborn. When I got saved, my mom said, God has taken my firstborn son from me. And I turned to her and I said, Mom, he hasn't taken your firstborn son. You gave me to him. He just decided to collect.
And did she laugh?
It gave her pause to think.
You said it was a funny story.
Oh, funny, ironic, not funny, humorous.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yep.
And so that's kind of interesting to me that I could point back to the ceremony and say what God did, he was in his perfect rights to do.
Yeah. 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 Redemption there twice, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and God arranged the birth order in my family, so he's in charge. In that sense, I've always wanted to have a godly line.
Yeah.
Because I'm the priest head of my line. I'm the redeemed one. But what this tells us is very interesting. The church functions as an extended family. And it should be household, not house sold. And no matter how bad I look through this, my dictation software always changes it. Okay?
Yes.
The church, or kochel, that's the word for ecclesia in Hebrew. See, I can do that from looking at the Septuagint and do those equivalents, is an extension of the family. This is why God did not design, I'm going to get burned for this probably, female pastors. I'm not saying women can't be in ministry. I'm saying the office of pastor is the way it is because the church is an extension of the household. So think of the church as a large household. That's why we use the term brothers and sisters. Okay, because the church is an extension of the household. My household are my blood relations. Okay, and they could be spiritual relations too, but the church are my spiritual extended family. And so what goes for the church in the building of the office is an extension of the roles that exist in the household. And so can women minister? I think they ought to minister. Can women be pastors? No. And I had a big fight. I shouldn't say fight. I had a big disagreement with a sister who wanted to push female pastors. Okay.
Well, was her issue with you or her issue was with the Bible?
Well, her issue was the way she interpreted the Bible.
Oh,
okay.
So I get to choose the way I interpret it now. That's fun.
Well, and that's the problem. Okay. She was going to sections in the Old Testament saying, well, what about Deborah? Well, I didn't say you couldn't be a judge.
Yeah.
But a pastor isn't an Old Testament judge. Okay. Don't confuse your offices.
Right.
And you don't have to be a pastor to be a missionary. That would get me in trouble with some other folks. I don't think you have to necessarily be a pastor to be a missionary. I don't think you have to be a pastor to be a seminary teacher. And some guys would look at me funny. Now, do I think you should have qualifications morally? Yeah. I think you can rightly be dismissed from a seminary post if you're engaging in material that would dismiss a church elder because you are similarly in a position of influence, but not because of the qualifications, but because of the principle that those who lead have to do. Okay?
Yes.
But this is creational order. You can get as mad as you want. God created Adam and Eve in a certain creational order, and that creational order should be observed. The rest of the passages, I do a changeover here, and I kind of wish that the controls would stay right near. Okay, that's because the controls are on the other side. Maybe I can move the controls to this side. Thank you. New share. I will love it when I can do it. Screen 2, and it's blue, so that's good. There we go. We're going to see some stuff about the band. Okay, and I'm turning just a little out of the corner of my eye, to go ahead and talk about this band. 29 deals with a person doomed to destruction. Okay. And so no person doomed to destruction, 29 and 30, and all the tithes of the field and the seeds of the land, the fruit of the tree shall be holy to the Lord. If a man wants to redeem any of the tithes, he shall add a fifth to it. Okay, we're getting through this. But that term doomed to destruction ought to have popped out at you. Okay, that's a particular Hebrew word. Let me bring the Hebrew word up, okay? Harem is the Hebrew word. And it's a very particular Hebrew word. Some things belong to God, but not as far as God's use, but as far as his removal. So if there was something that was hostile to God's order that would bring destruction to the Israelites following God, it was under herem, or destruction. We see this of certain towns in the Old Testament where God says completely destroy them.
Yes.
Okay. These towns were under harem. They were under the ban. All right. This happened with things that would undermine biblical theocracy. They represented a danger to Israel and to the children of Israel. We see this with Jericho. Jericho is doomed to destruction except for Rahab and her family. We see this with Ai, who takes a forbidden thing and he pays with it for his life, because that city was under harem, and so he had no right to that object. And if you recall the story, Achan takes, and it's actually Achan. So all pastors' jokes about Achan was Achan after he got killed are all based on a linguistic mispronunciation. Achan, I believe, is the way the word's pronounced. It's probably a guttural. There isn't a CH in Hebrew. So when I see a CH, I immediately think a guttural or a hey, which is a normal H. And so he takes something he shouldn't take, and he pays for it with his life because it was harem. It was to be given to God, either to be destroyed, but metals could be melted down. They could be reclaimed. All right. And so these are things that are under ban because in their present form, they would undermine the theocracy of Israel, such as idols. They could lead the children of Israel into idolatry.
That was prophetic.
Yep. Oops. I gotta go to the screen share and switch back over. And I'll go back to the PowerPoint and share. Good. We're back there. Okay. And now we're getting to the end of the chapter. This is where it all culminates. 2 verses have the similar wording, very, very similar wording. Okay, so the same idea is there. Remember, we talked about these are the statutes and judgments and laws which the Lord made between himself and the children of Israel by the hand of Moses. When you get to the last verse of 34, you see these are the commandments which the Lord commanded Moses for the children of Israel. Where?
At the mountain.
At the mountain. In 26, where were these commanded?
You were still at the mountain, right?
Right. The idea is that these provisions are tied to the law that was received at Sinai. And that's what Kyle and Delich are saying here. The laws contained in the chapter are brought to a close in verse 34. And a new concluding formula, see 2646, by which these are attached to the law given at Sinai. In other words, these carry the exact same authority at the rest of the law on Sinai.
Oh, addendums, yes.
Right. Now, my dad would like to say that only the 10 commandments are binding, but they're not. Because Moses, through God, is telling me that these are as authoritative as the rest of the law.
Yeah.
So I can't pick
given
and
by
choose.
The hand of Moses, right?
Right. Now let's look at the take-home truth. This is the last take-home truth in all of Leviticus. The extent to which we acknowledge the holiness of God is demonstrated not only in pious exercise, but how we handle our material goods. The biblical worldview does not separate finance from spirituality. It doesn't mean we have to be perfect or we can't be poor or we have to be wealthy, or being wealthy is wrong either. What it means is that this is connected to, it's an expression of our spirituality. It's not always a perfect expression. I can't assume because somebody isn't a genius with money that they're unspiritual. But what I can say is they can't divorce their spirituality from their financial handling. They're non-separable. They are connected. And so what I'd say to the believer in debt is, we went through Ramsey. Don't put yourself in a position where you're under the jurisdiction of an unsaved person, because your master may not be sensitive to all the things of God. And so you're going to run into conflict, quite possibly. You're also less free. Will you possibly... Go ahead.
I'm sorry. So kind of a general statement / question. in studying in Leviticus how dedication was made, not only of firstborn, but of dedicating property, your home, or something to the Lord, we learn God's intention for how we manage our material goods today.
Yeah. We learn that God is very interested in. See, this is why we're not Buddhists, in a sense. It's one of the reasons. The material is not unreal. The material is part of the creation.
Yes.
And so God does not make himself the God of the ethereal and not the God of the material.
Right.
And unlike Buddhism, we don't try to eliminate all personal distinction and ownership of property. This is also why socialism, dare I say it, is totally wrong, because my property doesn't belong to the state, it belongs to the Lord.
Yeah.
And the minute I give the state the ability to dictate over my property, I am now giving them the ability to dictate to God.
Yeah.
And so I'd say to the believer, look, I understand politics is a dangerous thing, but you have to understand here, the socialistic system is antithetical to your allegiance to the kingdom of God.
Yeah. Yeah. And then God kind of closes the loop on the whole deal by instituting a year of Jubilee, in which things can return to those who purchased them.
Right. And God is not uninterested in the poor, but God's way of dealing with poverty is distinctly different. God's way of dealing with poverty is opportunity. Okay. Not the equalizing of outcomes.
Oh yeah, that's also important. Yeah, I need to think on that, because that is not a biblical theme that is often discussed.
Right. And
usually that's discussed in terms of charity,
right,
not in terms of opportunity.
Right. What God gives is he maintains a level of opportunity for all people. Okay. This is why our founding fathers wrote the pursuit of life, liberty, not the result of life, liberty, and happiness.
Well, in Article 1 of the Constitution, they do say life, liberty, and property. It links life, liberty, and property to the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. So we can go into the political discourse another time, but both concepts are in there, and it does link you back to your opportunity with your property.
Well, because wealth in their day, much like in the Israelites' day, was tied to the ownership of property. Because remember, not everyone was a tradesman, and everyone was still reliant on the land.
That's right. That makes sense.
And so property was commerce. Now, there were some tradesmen, and there were priests, and there were other classes, but understand that the major economic engine was still agricultural.
Yes, that's right.
So, it wasn't who could sell the most computers or come up with the best operating system. And this is hard for people to grasp, because we have become almost completely a non-agrarian society.
Right. It makes the concepts harder for people today to understand.
Well, this is what Bible study is about, is translating the text into today and saying, okay, what is the biblical worldview, or what is God's story? And then let's look at it from our story and see how it ties together.
Yes.
But the overarching principle is that everything the believer owns belongs first and foremost to God. And so any entity that interferes with the believer's ability to dispose his own property interferes with the believer's ability to worship.
Right. Hence, right back down to the concept that the tithes is just giving back to God what is already his.
And notice that it's the top 10.
Yeah.
See,
first fruits. Yes.
First fruits. Yeah. See, I'd say to somebody, the principle of tithing is not based on Old Testament tithing as much as it's based on first fruits.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense.
And so when believers say to me, they try to legalistically regulate tithing, I'd say, well, okay, you're looking at it the wrong way. Does God get the first fruits? All right.
Yeah, that's right. You're exactly right. A lot of people tend to take a materialistic view, or I'm sorry, the legalistic view, and say, well, it has to be that or not. And then God comes along and says, hold on, this is something you bring to me, and He tries to reteach it in the cheerful giver.
Right.
Yeah.
Because it's not the quantity, it's the quality
Yeah,
of the gift.
and that is consistent with Leviticus.
It is.
It is consistent. It's
You
not a
know,
parallel exactly, but it's consistent.
it's consistent. God is dealing a little differently here because the economic system is tied to the temple.
Yes.
Okay. So that was a theocracy. We have to be really careful of just pulling an Old Testament principle out.
Yeah.
An unnamed person made the comparison between Jesus rebuking the priests and we should rebuke the leaving president over the riots. Now, regardless of your politics, the problem I had with that analogy is it's a false comparison.
It is a false comparison. Your premise is flawed.
Your premise is flawed because the priests were God's representatives to God's people. The society was a theocracy, not a secular society. America is not Israel, and the president is not presiding over representing God to his people. In fact, some presidents need God's people to represent God to him.
That's right.
And so it's a false premise to borrow from an incident with Jesus and Israel as a theocracy, where he's chiding the theocracy for not being the true theocracy it was meant to be, and go ahead and transfer that to America, which is a democratic republic, which is a different form of government, and say these are equivalent situations.
Yeah. And I agree with you. It's a false premise.
Yeah. And that comes from not thinking through the story back then and the context now, and saying, okay, what carries over, if anything, and what doesn't?
Yeah.
And see, that's where good biblical theology and Bible study is so important, because these distinctions will get sloppy and lost if they aren't fully understood and reinforced.
Yeah.
So
yep, that's right.
I don't know what ended up happening with YouTube. I may have to go back and undo what I did. But if nothing else, this is actually recorded, and I could go ahead and put it up and take the risk there. Oh, someone did show up. Oh, wow. Oh, that's so cool. It's Chris from Vermont.
Hello, Chris.
Yeah. I'll just say thanks for being here. I just saw you. That's really cool. You have to understand the background. Chris was somebody I got to baptize.
Oh, that is.
And he asked about the angel of death, but I don't know if it was a question about the angel of death.
Well, I think that was probably in reference to the redemption of the firstborn discussion that we were having earlier.
Okay, and that was God's judgment. He says, "I will execute judgment on the gods of Egypt."
Yeah.
So, the angel of the death is under the jurisdiction of God. But I just saw him. Why didn't I
plague? It was a plague. It was meant to be punishing. Without the blood of the lamb, you would be passed. Without the blood of the lamb, you wouldn't be passed over, and you would be subject to the.
And that's what you say to people now.
Yeah.
Understand that while you're living in this world and you're unsaved, you may be a nice person and you may be sincerely worshiping God.
Yeah.
According to what you know about him. But the problem is you're still under the jurisdiction of a fallen world.
Yeah. It's
not its master.
It's not about how nice you are. It's never been that, and it's never going to be that.
Right.
It's about being flawed.
It's about being flawed, and it's about being under the jurisdiction of a fallen world system.
Yeah.
So
but God, still, that's a good question if I understand correctly the context in which it was made.
Oh, I think that you probably do. So that's cool, and it's great that Chris was here and if he has any other questions. I know that we're way over. Chris, we have exhausted the normal time for a Hillside Sunday School. What I'm planning to do is start working on doing an outreach study on Messianic prophecy, and we'll talk about the individual prophecies, how Jesus fulfilled them, and how do we know they're Messianic prophecies? Because see, if your Bible says that on top, the English writer put that heading there. So is there a way that these prophecies build on each other, in such a way that we can know down the line that they're Messianic prophecies? And we'll understand that the people who got those prophecies may have had reasons to believe they were Messianic prophecies, but they didn't have that in their headings in their Bible.
Yeah.
They had to come at that a different way.
Well, I look forward to that study.
Okay.
And regarding the Exodus just completed, Exodus can be a very complex topic. There's many topics in Exodus, of course, and they can be complex, they can be messy, they can be, well, like you said earlier, God is a God of reality. In an earlier class, in Exodus gets messy. It talks about the human condition. And I think you've done a good job helping us wrap our minds around some of the principles in it and bring it to meaning in the modern day. So thank you.
Well, my pleasure. And it's been great doing that. Thank you for being so faithful. Thank you to the folks that will watch this on YouTube after. It may not be the most popular broadcast, but I'm hoping that Bible study will be something that can be done, both as outreach and then maybe even some things taped, and just keep doing that because I think it's part of what I'm supposed to do and why I've been gathering this equipment piece by piece. And so that would be good. I'm going to end the session, and then I'll have a few minutes to say hey to Chris. I kind of wish this worked better from Zoom to YouTube, but it is the way it is. So,
well, I'm going to leave. Thank you, Jeff.
My pleasure. Thanks for being so faithful.
You bet.